Teach something to Fatiha. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillah. Wassalatu wassalamu ala sayyidina Rasulullah wa alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Allahumma ya munawwir ya fattah. نور قلوبنا بمعرفتك وافتح لنا ابواب حكمتك واجعل رحمتك انك على كل شيء قدير. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما واخلاصا وصدقا في الدين. ولا حول ولا قوه الا بالله العلي العظيم. وصلى الله وسلم على نبينا محمد وعلى اله وصحبه اجمعين. Alhamdulillah. I was hoping that this was going to be the last class for this particular course, but I think it's probably going to need like one more at least. We'll see. But we got through talking a little bit about the Kalam tradition, about the Sunnah, and establishing the foundations for Muslim life, and for our theology, for our praxis, and for our spirituality. That becomes the merit of the discipline of Ilm Kalam and what it aims to provide Muslims. As we said before, the definition of Ilm Kalam that's going to be the verified understanding of the discipline is Ilm al-Aqa'id al-Diniyya and al-Adilla al-Yaqiniyya. It's a knowledge that one arrives at the doctrines of the religion and the knowledge of why those doctrines are true. So it gives you the what and the why. What we believe as Muslims, and then why those beliefs are true. And insofar as we have discussed looking at the different doctrinal points about the Sunnah and Jama'ah in contrast to all of the different things that we have looked at in this course, the different firaq, Sunnah, what they were saying, the positions that they held in contrast to the things that we know, I hope that this provided some clarity in terms of what we believe and how those beliefs engage the different types of philosophical understandings that could emerge and that we see even in the day and age that we live today. Now, what's interesting is if we have a little bit more time, we can go through the very process itself by which we understand knowledge, what knowledge is in terms of how we understand it, and then how that is used and utilized in terms of the approach that we take as a Sunnah to understand the judgments that we make about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and about prophets and so on and so forth. But we don't really need to get into that type of detail for this class, inshallah. That is definitely something that we're going to talk about when we go through the course on theology. We have different lectures online. Inshallah, we can go through something together soon. Now, what's interesting is we would assume, and this was somewhat assumed in the early period by the Muslims, that what we believe as Ahl Sunnah through the vantage point of theology becomes the approach that we take to not only understand our religion, but to also operationalize it, to engage it in a way that brings about the realizations that we're looking for. Like ultimately we're doing this in order for us to arrive to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Like the venture of theology itself and what we're doing insofar as engaging our tradition in this way is to arrive at a knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or ma'rifah. And why this is really important is because, as we'll come to see later, theology is not going to be the discipline that necessarily allows you to arrive at that conclusion. And the assumption that it was going to be the discipline to arrive at that conclusion, I would say, is somewhat a false premise. Like the idea that this is the discipline to allow one to arrive at this complete understanding and holistic vision of how one relates to and engages with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was something that was going to be challenged quite early. And the way in which it's challenged in our tradition and how it comes full circle in terms of giving us this holistic understanding of our we see in the life of Imam Hujjatul Islam Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, rahimahullah ta'ala. So what I want to try to do with the limited amount of time that we have is to go through the life of Imam al-Ghazali and what he brings to this discussion that I believe is extremely important for us to understand. You know, one of the things that very early in my own time, in my own sort of venture of understanding, studying, and trying to practice and implement this religion, that I became very aware of was that the way that I was approaching it and the way that I think we are made to assume to approach it, even until today, where we like hold these great conventions and we see people speak and we get like really intellectual with it and we try to like parse a lot of academic material and we think that that is the way that we're going to bring about a realization of this religion. It's completely false. And, you know, take it from someone who spent a lot of time probably in different ventures of this religion for reasons that, to say it lightly, were simply just egotistical. They really have nothing to do with properly bringing about a realization of what this religion is calling us towards. And it's really important, you know, what the Majlis is doing and the whole sort of project of the Majlis is to try and bring about a realization that centers on the very goal of the religion itself in a way that's palatable, in a way that's accessible to everyone. It's the reason why we always say here that everything is kind of grounded in love and service. If you know love and service and you understand, so
is this better? Maybe this is better. Assalamu alaikum. So I changed the audio. Hopefully this is better. I don't know.
No, it's because this is over here.
It's better now.
So I switched it over to something else now. So I think, yeah, okay.
It's better now?
Yeah, so hopefully this is better. All right. I was going through this and then
Oh, that one's
and
better?
then I switched over to this
Switch over to
laptop.
This should be better.
Alhamdulillah. Anyway, so the idea here is that what we're trying to do goes beyond simply a analytical process of arriving at particular truth claims. We want to know what we believe is true, and that venture is important, but it's important for a very particular reason. And beyond that, one has to understand, like, what exactly are we after insofar as this deen is concerned? And when you understand it as centered in love and service, it becomes very easy to know what you're supposed to be doing, the things that we should be focusing on and emphasizing, versus those things that probably we don't really need to emphasize or focus on per se. Does that make sense? And again, this is displayed probably more so than any other point of history within the Islamic intellectual tradition in the life of Imam Hujjatul Islam Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, rahimahullah ta'ala. So we'll begin with that. Let me share my screen so that people on Zoom also are with us, inshallah. Okay. So this quote actually is really important for the very reason that I've just been talking about. whoever thinks that the unveiling of truth depends on precisely formulated proofs has indeed straightened the broad mercy of God. So what do you think this means? You open it up because I feel like I've been talking a lot already. Yeah.
I think like it's not like an A, B, C step.
Yeah.
Like go from A to like B, and then back to B, and then all the way to L. It's your turn.
Interesting. Okay. Anybody else? Yeah.
Essentially, I think if you think you're so arrogant that the feeling of truth has to come through you, then you're really constricting the mercy of God. And if it doesn't come through you, it's going to come through somebody else.
Mm.
And so if you're so arrogant to think that, then you're really constricting the mercy of God to just through you.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. Who else? Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. I mean, the idea of, precisely formulated proofs being the sort of means to ma'rifah, or knowing of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Those who know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala oftentimes don't really depend on any type of syllogistic proof. People that have an experiential understanding of the divine have transcended the idea of, these analytic understandings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala altogether. It's not to say that it's not there, because arguably, from a very fitri perspective, one is very inclined to understand reality using rationality. If people say things like 1 and 1 and 1 equals 1, you're going to have a problem with that if your fitra is intact. But understanding the religion through this idea of experience becomes kind of the venture of Imam Muhammad al-Ghazali, and he brings it into communication with those who are seeking to try and provide this marriage between rationality, or rational discourse, and revelation. This idea of reason and revelation coming together in a very sort of harmonious and seamless fashion, and then brought into a more holistic reality wherein which experience of the divine becomes where we sort of lead to. Like the idea of us knowing what the doctrines of our religion are and why those doctrines are proof allow us to arrive at a place that establishes a foundation wherein which now we actually go forth and do this religion and bring about these realizations. And when they come in a way that allow for us to know what these particular doctrines are, not simply as an analytic truth, but something that we've experienced, something that we feel, something that we have tasted, as Imam al-Ghazali will talk about. So his name was Imam Abu Hamid Muhammad ibn Muhammad al-Ghazali Tusi, rahimahullah ta'ala. He was also known as Hujjat al-Islam, which is the proof of Islam. And people don't get these titles, by the way, for no reason. It's not just like a title that some people said and caught on. If you get a title like this and it's well recognized amongst the ummah that you were the proof of Islam, there's a reason. Like something happened. So he's known as Al-Ghazali. It's also known that you can pronounce it Al-Ghazali, where the shidda is on the Z, right? And he was born in 450 Hijri. He died in the year 505, which is 1111 Common Era. He was born in Tabaran, which is a town in the district of Tus in current-day northern Iran. He was born to a very pious family who were somewhat poor. His father was a simple man, and his father was known to have a real sincere love for scholars and a real sincere love for knowledge and scholarship, even though he wasn't himself a scholar, right? But it was his goal to instill that love in his children. His father dies when he and his brother, as a matter of fact, Ahmed al-Ghazali, who himself is a pillar of the understandings of spirituality in this tradition, even though we don't really talk much about Imam Ahmed al-Ghazali. But they were quite young when their father passed away. And he leaves them in the care of a very pious man with the instruction of raising these children to be pious people. Like, that was what he wanted. And so this man puts them into a madrasa. At the time, it was probably the cheapest route to take, where room and board and study and food, you kind of like have a package deal for something that was quite cheap, and at the same time you would be able to learn this religion. And so Ahmed and Muhammad both had that particular trajectory in front of them. Both of them really had an aptitude for learning. They mastered really what could be mastered in Tus at the time, which is hard for us to imagine in the world we live in today, where someone could master everything that is in the confines of the city. As we'll come to see, that even in the pre-modern period, one could master the entirety of the sciences that there were. And this is something that Imam Abu Hamid was known for. But he goes on, both of them, as a matter of fact, go on to be quite remarkable in their understanding of this religion. And Abu Hamid in particular, insofar as the acquired sciences are concerned, really strives. He eventually will take on a position, but before so, he studies with really the scholar of his time, and the individual that even until today we look to for a understanding of the legal theory of our religion and a proper orientation of understanding the usul, foundations of our religion. Imam al-Haramain, as they call him, Imam al-Haramain, Imam al-Juwayni, rahimahullah ta'ala. And Imam al-Juwayni takes Imam al-Ghazali and really begins to cultivate someone who not only is extremely gifted insofar as the understanding of the basic foundations of the religion, but extends upon that in ways that are going to be quite profound for the very theory that we hold, systematically speaking, insofar as how this tradition works and is applied properly. In 1092, Imam Abu Hamid al-Ghazali is given a post by Nizam al-Mulk. And this individual we could say a lot about, but we don't really have too much time. This was an individual from Islamic political history who every one of us know as a matter of concepts that really become prevalent in the way that we understand what Sunni theology is. And the reason is because the project of Nizam al-Mulk during this time is really to establish a kind of Sunni orthodoxy. And so he does so, and one of the main sort of ways that he's going to establish it is through Imam Abu Hamid al-Ghazali and those who came before him. Now, when he hires him, basically, or appoints him as one of the court scholars and an educator within the Nizamiya system, one of the first things that Imam Abu Hamid al-Ghazali begins to do is to write refutations against the Batiniya, who were an Ismaili group, Seveners, who had kind of an esotericist understanding of the religion, and their methodology was a methodology that had become somewhat prevalent in society. So these were some of the first individuals that Imam al-Ghazali took on. And he took them on from an epistemological perspective. And what everyone saw in Imam Abu Hamid al-Ghazali was that this individual was extremely gifted at debate and dialectic. The ability that he had to take on anyone and completely destroy their argument was almost unmatched. And he recognized that this was also quite advantageous in the way that he was going to continue to be upwardly mobile in society. Because the better that you were at this, the better position that you were going to be able to get, maybe the more money that you were going to make, more acclaim, so on and so forth. And so this became kind of his trajectory in life. Now, he wrote a number of texts in this early period. One of them is called the Maqasid al-Falasifa, which are the objectives of the philosophers. He writes this text not being one of the philosophers. And again, we're talking about people like Ibn Sina here, right? And we talked a little bit about the doctrines of the Falasifa and the methodology. So he writes a text basically giving a summative understanding of what the objectives of the Falasifa are. And in many ways, people were somewhat confused because they didn't really know, like, are you one of them or what's going on here? And interestingly enough, this text actually was seen by the philosophical tradition of the time as being something that was a standard in the actual methodology of the Falasifa, right? After he writes this text, he then writes Tahafut al-Falasifa, or like the, destruction of the philosophers, as they say, right? So in many ways, it's like he wrote the book on philosophy for the peripatetic tradition. It was accepted by those scholars, and then after it was accepted, he then refutes them, right? Why would someone do that? And what's the point of doing that? Yeah.
I think to show that he understands what the line of reason is.
Yeah.
And that I know exactly where you're coming from. And so this is why you're right.
Yeah. And it's really a brilliant way of showing that what we're after is not simply a polemical discourse where like it's my team versus your team, but rather that there's truth and we're all vested in truth as human beings. So, we can arrive at this together. And the approach that he takes, particularly in this fashion, where he shows them that I know exactly what this is all about. I know this methodology, and then refutes it afterwards, makes it very clear that there are problems here, right? And as a matter of fact, this is something that is going to hold a lot of weight even after the time of Imam Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, even though we're going to find that there's an integration of philosophy that happens after him. But people were very aware of the sort of red flags, right, within this discipline and the methodology. He also writes Mihak al-Nadar, or Ma'yar al-Nadar, which is like the touchstone of reasoning and logic. Mizan al-Amal, which is an amazing text in moral ethics, the criterion of action. He writes in the subject of usul, so the maqasid. He also writes on the subject of fiqh for the Shafi'i school, al-Wajiz and al-Basit, as well as in theology, right? So he has al-Qawa'id al-Aqaid in the Ihya. He also has al-Iqtisad. He has Arba'in for Usul al-Din. These are like monumental texts, right? And he also produces an autobiography towards the end of his life where he recounts his experiences of studying and engaging in the religion in a way that brought him to the height of scholarship and fame and like the sort of grandeur with the people. And as he says, it brought me all of these luxuries with the world and left me empty with Allah. Like he reached the height of the religious pursuits in the worldly sense, right? So he memorizes the Quran very early. He masters all the sciences. He surpasses his teachers. Like Imam al-Juwayni, the great Imam al-Juwayni says about Imam Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, "Kana bahrun mughdiq," that he was like an ocean that pours down on you, right? And yet he knew deep down inside that he was an imposter, that there was something off. He saw himself as a phony, and that all of this knowledge and this stature meant nothing in addressing these internal realities which were at the heart of everything, right? And this goes back again to the very premise of the discussion that we were having. Yeah, I know all of these mutun, and I have this really exquisite knowledge of the religion, but yet it's not really affecting me. It's not really doing anything to me. So what's the point? What's the point of having all of that if it's not really motivating the actions that you take and bringing you closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And really, a lot of us who have gone into this venture of studying the religion will tell you that this is something that we all have attested to. Particularly people who go into Sharia studies or theology. Okay? Like, I know people that will tell me when they went and studied Sharia, I studied law and the formal disciplines so much that my heart became dry. Like, I became rigid and I was like unbearable to be with. And I was extremely critical and judgmental of everyone and everything that I saw. I always saw people in this very judgmental kind of way. And really what that means is that you're seeing everyone in a bad light, which is the exact opposite of what we're being called to do in this religion. Husn al-dhann, right? To have like a good opinion of people. I can't even see that given the study of the religion in this sort of formalistic fashion. And Imam al-Ghazali is renowned in our tradition and goes down in history because of his courage and his honesty in writing about what he experienced in this light. Like, he was very upfront about everything that he went through. And in many ways, that's why they say that Imam al-Ghazali is actually writing not to the laity oftentimes, but to the scholars and to the students and to those who are taking it upon themselves to really study this religion. Because he's saying, look, I was you. I did this. I went down that path. And I'm telling you, this is what happened to me so that it doesn't happen to you. Now, if you read Imam al-Ghazali, the way that he writes, he's like a joy to read. And again, this is very different than most scholars per se. Like, if you read academics, it's very boring stuff, right? I am an academic, so it's like, I'll tell you, like, the stuff that we write and read is really boring. And it's really speaking only to a certain audience oftentimes. Whereas what he's writing and the way that he's writing oftentimes makes really complex ideas very simple. He writes in, using these metaphors, schemes, and different tropes that allow for the actual experience of reading what it is that he's writing to be quite joyful. His brevity and his ability to illustrate what is profoundly difficult is something that is celebrated even until today. But people who have honestly read him and understand the discourse that he's speaking to, like the tradition that he comes from, and what he did to that tradition, know that this individual was a mujaddid of this religion, was someone who revived the religion in a time where there was like a rigid formalism around what this religion was. And what he did was that he brought to life an essential characteristic of the prophetic legacy that had been lost in his time and continues to be lost on many, even today, who try and approach the religion without heeding his commentary on what happens when you simply read books and study without understanding and without real implementation and real embodiment, right? Like, it's not simply just rote memorization and affirmations of the mind and this kind of formal adherence to the outward manifestations of the religion that makes you an inheritor of the prophetic way, that makes you an inheritor of this Muhammadan way. But these realities have to live inside of you. They have to live at the core of who you are. And again, that is one of the reasons why this individual is so celebrated. When a human being can be as vulnerable as he was in highlighting the truth, it resonates with everyone. And we see this, right? Now, what's very important to note, and one of my teachers actually said this as well, is that when we're reading Imam al-Ghazali, we're not simply just reading like a really interesting tale. And it is, we've always talked about how amazing a movie this would be if somebody would just make the movie properly, right? But that's not really the reason why we're reading him. And that's not the reason why I'm presenting him in this fashion. The reason why I'm presenting him in this fashion is because what he does is he brings this tradition to life in a way that shows us how to understand everything that we have taken up until this point. What does it mean to understand our doctrines in the way that the Mutakallimun discussed? and where all these ideas had kind of been placed prior to that with the falasifa, and how does that make sense for me in my life insofar as living this religion, doing it in a way that brings about these realities. That's what Imam Ghazali really provides us, right? Now, he recognizes that there's something going on with him. And he knows that, you know, these problems are not really going to go away. And he had been confronted by many people, as a matter of fact, to give up the post that he was in and go off and try to reconcile these issues, these internal issues that he had, right? And mind you, again, like, you know, Imam al-Ghazali at the time had risen to such height that, you know, it was said that thousands of people would attend his lectures. Everyone knew who he was. He was the most famous scholar of the area, the head of like the biggest college in the Islamic world at the time. And so, you know, giving up a post like that was not going to be easy. And so he wrestled with it constantly. He knew that there was something wrong. He would wrestle with it. And then, as he would say in the Munqidh, I would kind of let it go and go back to life as usual. And then it would pop up again, and I'd realize that I have to do something about this. And then life would go on as usual. He'd forget about it, and he'd get back into his groove again. And again, this is very similar to the way that our lives work. You know, there's a problem. We don't really deal with it. And after a while, we just kind of go back to life as usual, you know, with the problem unaddressed. And so this is exactly what happens to Imam al-Ghazali until, as he says, and this is documented in the actual Munqidh itself, he didn't have the choice. He actually got up in front of the students and those who were in attendance. Oftentimes, many of them were scholars. And as he says, he couldn't speak. Like, he physically couldn't say anything. So you can imagine how embarrassing this is. Like, everybody's here to hear him speak, to hear him, you know, give these like very riveting lectures that he gives, and he can't say anything. And he leaves, and everybody kind of sees him as being sick, you know, and at the time, what they would have diagnosed him with, you know, maybe a little bit interesting in terms of how we think about it today, but they diagnosed him with melancholia. You know, like this individual had kind of gone a complete opposite of his personality. You know, oftentimes choleric individuals are known to be individuals that are like go-getters. You know, the managerial personality that is, you know, about getting things done. And you know, this is probably the persona that he took on. And everything that he did was he himself doing it, getting everything done. I got to get this done. I got to get that done. It allows you to do a lot of work and to actually produce a lot until it comes to a point where you no longer have anything to give because you've given all of yourself and you're done. And so to this extent, he literally could not even speak anymore. It's interesting. It's every time that I go through this story, it's like I have to check myself on so many levels. Because it's really easy to be put in a scenario where it's like I'm talking about, you know, the exact position in many ways that Imam al-Ghazali is telling us all to be very, very weary of. He actually said, one of the things that he said was when he looked at what he was doing in the religion, he really wasn't doing anything outside of just talking about the religion. And he knew that, you know, when it came to talking about the religion, he could talk about the religion. But that was really all that he was doing. It was just talking. There was no like real embodied practice of the religion and something that was motivating him in any way, shape, or form. Allah protect us from this. So he reaches this breaking point, right? And, you know, in many ways, this becomes sort of the ticket for him to realize what it is that he had for so long put off. And so he leaves his appointment as the head instructor of the Nizamiya, and he goes to Hashem, right? He tells them that he wants to go to Mecca to do Umrah and Hajj and these kinds of things. And before he goes there, he ends up going to Hashem, and he stays there for quite some time. And afterwards ends up traveling to Mecca and other areas. And, you know, in the Munqidh min al-Dalal autobiography that he writes, the time period that he spends on this hiatus is, you know, oftentimes debated. Like, how long did he actually go? Allahu a'lam. But it was during this time that he writes his magnum opus, which is known as the Ihya Ulumuddin, or the Revivification of the Religious Sciences. And it's a really important name for us to think about. The revivification, like the revival, you know, bringing back to life the religious sciences. And it's a really life-changing text during this moment of kind of like life-changing experience that he goes through. He returns to Tus, where he's from, and then after making istikhara, he goes back to the Nizamiya and continues to teach. He also taught at other places as well, right? Now, what Imam al-Ghazali illustrates in his autobiography, which is really important for us to think about, is, as he says, there were really 4 paths to seeking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that he found to be the predominant paths, okay? And what's interesting is that we've gone through these paths. And so, you know, in a way, we're kind of going through them once more, but through the lens of Imam al-Ghazali to help us contextualize what each of these things are, right? Now, the first path that he is going to talk about in this text are the falasifa. As a matter of fact, the first path that he talks about is knowledge itself, or what's known as epistemology, okay? And there's a really interesting discussion there. We're not going to get into it, but what's important about it is that he's treating this in a way that's holistic. He's saying, look, as an individual, as a human being, journeying to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or to the truth, the reality, we have to be exhaustive about this. And we have to think about it in a very critical way. How do we know what we know to begin with? And as he says, why does it seem like there are some individuals who grow up in a particular household, let's say they're Christians, who end up being Christian, and Jewish children who end up being Jewish, and Muslim children who end up being Muslim? Like, there's a kind of socialization process that seems to be indicative of why you adopt the way of life that you adopt. And so is that all it really is? Is it just you were born in Egypt or in Syria or wherever, and so now you're probably going to be a Muslim, versus those who are born in other areas that are predominantly Christian, who are just going to be Christian? Or is there something more to this? And so he began with the question of knowledge itself. How do we know what we know? Can we come to know anything, as a matter of fact? And in the same light as the mutakallimun, he recognizes that there are going to be 3 main modalities by which human beings come to know. What are they? What else? So experiential, empirical is the same. Yeah. And then revelation, yeah, divine. And the last one is, well, we say it's illegal, the divine. Good, rational. Yes. Okay. So what's known as hukum adi, empirical judgments, hukum aqli, rational judgments, and hukum shar'i, legal judgments, or the judgments that come from the divine. Okay. Now, as he says, these particular categories give us an understanding of the sources of knowledge that we as human beings can come to know vis-a-vis the empirical world. And that knowledge is something that we're going to know through repeated observations of patterns. Okay, I let go of this, it falls down. I touch something that's boiling on the stove, I burn my hand, so on and so forth. I know things through my empirical observation of the world. The second, hukum aqli, a rational judgment, is something that I know through pure reason. That I can know certain conclusions vis-a-vis the way that the mind itself works and necessarily concludes when given a proposition, right? So half of 2 is 1, correct? And as they define it, it says that it doesn't need anything more than that for you to know that it's absolutely true. Like, it would be kind of absurd for me to say, well, I don't know if half 2 is 1, unless you give me a hadith where the Prophet ﷺ says that half 2 is 1. No, you don't need a hadith for that. What's your daleel, akhi? Like, the daleel is that that's something that is known necessarily of reason. Okay, that's the second category. And the third category is that which you come to know through divine revelation, a legal mandate, a stipulation that's given by the lawgiver. All right. And these are things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reveals to his messengers that they then give to us. Now, these 3 modalities are what Imam al-Ghazali says constitute an understanding of the sources of knowledge. And as he'll say, they comprise the very understanding that he himself had in engaging the tradition of Islam. The first group of individuals that he's going to try and engage with, okay, are the mutakallimun. And I'm going by sequential order as he goes through, right? Now, what he says about the mutakallimun is that these were individuals of nazar and jadal. What's nazar? What's that? Yeah, so, I mean, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, for example, أَفَلَا يَنْظُرُونَ إِلَى الْإِبِلِ كَيْفَ خُلِقَتْ. Have they not seen the camel, how it was created? Is he asking us to look at a camel? What's that verse saying? To reflect. Exactly. In other words, that if you reflect on this, there are certain conclusions that you can make vis-a-vis your intellect. You know that there had to have been something that brought this into existence. And you can also know certain attributes about that being that brought this into existence through your means of reasoning and reflection. Right? So the mutakallimun were people that, as Imam Ghazali said, preserve the doctrines of orthodoxy for orthodoxy's sake. They allowed us to know what it is that we believe in our religion and why those beliefs were true, and also refuted the problematic issues that arose in society. Now, oftentimes Imam Ghazali is accused of being someone who demotes the role of theology or who dismisses theology altogether. Right? This is false. And as he says in the Mumtad min al-Dalal, and we talked about this in our class on Mumtad min al-Dalal, he recognized that kalam, theology, had a role. And that role, as he says, was sufficient in achieving the objectives that it had. This discipline is about providing an understanding of what we believe and why those beliefs are true, and it does that. But for him, he said that wasn't my objective. I knew those things. I understood what our doctrines were. I understood the proofs that were given. I accepted that. I didn't have an issue when it comes to having yaqeen or certainty about these doctrines. For me, I had an issue in motivating myself in relationship to those doctrines. So one thing to know something, it's another thing to be motivated by those things that you know. And so that's why he, in many ways, pushes kalam to the side, not because kalam as a discipline doesn't achieve the objectives that it has, but because it's not the objectives that he has. Does that make sense? Then he talks about the philosophers and the philosophical tradition. And he says that these were people that were interested in rational knowledge and apodictic demonstration. These were also individuals who, had plunged into a variety of different disciplines, like logic and mathematics and metaphysics and natural philosophy, which today we would just call science. Okay? And they had a lot to say about these things. Insofar as he was concerned, the philosophers also failed at the project that they sought to try and achieve. Okay, so unlike the Mutakallimun, who we said they had a project that achieved their ends, but I just wasn't interested in that per se, I was after something else. The philosophers didn't achieve their ends. They did not arrive at the objectives that they had. Why? He says, because the objectives that they had were to try and provide a totalizing conceptual theory of the world using nothing other than the world in their mind. And that leaves a person high and dry. You're not going to arrive at the conclusions that you need to arrive at if you're simply relying on the world and your mind to get you there. There has to be revelation. There has to be an understanding of the divine that enters into the equation. Otherwise, you may know certain things, then there are going to be a whole host of other things that you're going to get wrong. Like look at a guy like Ibn Sina, for example. Ibn Sina thought that he knew everything about everything. Like he literally thought that he knew everything that there was to know. And it turns out, maybe 2 centuries later, he was wrong about probably everything, other than like a few subjects here and there. And as Imam al-Ghazali says, his logic was fine, his mathematics were fine. There were certain concepts, obviously, that we take from him. And he does provide a framework that is going to be used by the ulama, particularly after Imam al-Ghazali, but everything else is completely false. His metaphysics is whack. The way that he understands natural philosophy is extremely problematic, right? Alhamdulillah, like we now know that the world, the supralunar world, is not consistent of eternal spherical bodies that are made of ether and that orbit in perfect circles and that have intellects. Like we're past that, alhamdulillah. And yet, in many ways, he became so infatuated with this approach that he lost sight of how one actually arrives at reality as it is. To actually arrive at reality as it is dependent wholly on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And there really is no other way to broach that topic. That is what Imam al-Ghazali provides in terms of his understanding of the philosopher. Like these were people who were too greedy. They didn't really have sufficient tools to arrive at the conclusions that they set out to arrive at. And as a result of which, it took them into very problematic areas, right? And his refutation of philosophy was to show that these were the problems. At the same time, there were people who wanted to say, like, Imam al-Ghazali completely destroyed philosophy in every way, shape, and form. Like he threw away anything philosophical from this sort of peripatetic tradition. That's also not true. Okay. And in many ways, as we'll come to see, historically speaking, Ibn Sina is integrated into the way that Ahl Sunnah are going to think about their tradition and used to try and provide a much more robust system overall, right? But they're doing it from a lens that Imam al-Ghazali provides them to allow one to understand how to approach this discipline properly and how not to approach it properly. So, I don't know if you all have seen this like clip of Neil deGrasse Tyson, who wants to say, how many people here know Neil deGrasse Tyson? Okay. So he gets on, I don't know where he was. He's like, the Muslims were this really amazing community of individuals early on, and the type of historical data that we have coming out of Baghdad in like the first 2-3 centuries was really phenomenal. And that is really what we think of when we think of the height of Islamic civilization, this golden age of Islam, quote unquote. Until Imam al-Ghazali comes to the scene. And then Imam al-Ghazali writes this refutation of the Philosophers, where he talks about how mathematics is from the devil and that we should abandon it completely. And this then leads to a stagnation and intellectual decline in the Muslim world that they have until today yet to recover from, right? And it's the reason why the West looks and acts and operates in the way that it does, and why these Middle Eastern and Muslim majority countries around the world look and act and, you know, behave in the way that they do. It's the reason why you have, you know, over almost 2 billion Muslims in the world, and yet there are only like 2 Nobel laureates, right? And all these other traditions who have far less individuals, far less from simply a population perspective, okay? They have far less people in their tradition, yet far more Nobel laureates. Now, what's interesting about this is that many Muslims have swallowed this narrative and have, in many ways, believed it. And they actually think that that is the type of reality that we're living in. And it isn't until we make these grand achievements in science, science becomes kind of like the main modality that we have to arrive at this conclusion, right? We're finally worthy of the West or something. But we still have yet to make any traction outside of, again, these 2 guys. That's absolutely garbage. It's poor scholarship. It's a narrative that has to be completely dismantled from the way that Muslims think about their tradition. It's a type of imperializing narrative that's used towards Muslims in a way that brings them into an understanding that makes them feel inferior to everything, right? And it wasn't simply just used on Muslims, by the way. It's just also used on the Hindu tradition. It was used on the Far Eastern traditions. Like, you'll find remnants of the same type of thing given to other traditions and civilizations in the world. Right? And it's important for us as Muslims to have our history straight, to know what actually did happen in terms of Muslim history. I'm not saying that everything's honky-dory, but it also isn't this. Like, Ghazali didn't come to the scene and like ruin everything. And anybody who reads Ghazali properly and who knows this man knows that's absolutely not what's going on. Does that make sense? So the Philosophers for Imam Ghazali are a group that get it wrong because they don't have a sufficient set of tools to be able to arrive at the objectives that they want, right? And as he's going to talk about more so in the Heft al-Falasifa and other texts, they really began to make grand claims on the basis of metaphysics from their understanding of physics. And as he says, those who are really, really skilled at physics are not necessarily skilled at metaphysics, right? And so we have to be able to differentiate between the two. And this is as he also talks about something that continues to happen, even until today. We see someone like Stephen Hawking, and we think, wow, this man is brilliant as a physicist. Like, really, some brilliant stuff. And so then we assume that everything that he says is also as brilliant. And, you know, I'll tell you that it's not. When you read, you know, forget the text. What's that? No, his other text. I mean, no. Anyways, and the point is that he begins. I think it's like at the first page, one of the, like the opening paragraph of this text, where he says that philosophy is dead. And I get what he's trying to say as someone who, you know, operates outside of the Department of Philosophy. philosophy is not really where intellectual thought is being produced today. It's become somewhat insignificant. But he says philosophy is dead, not really knowing all that much about philosophy. And then goes on to philosophize for the remainder of the book, right? Like he holds these grand philosophical positions. He has no real claim towards any of them. He doesn't ground them. He just assumes them to be true, and he works on that premise. So this is problematic. So that's the falasifa. So as Imam Ghazali says, some things that they said were good, we take them. Some things that they said were not good, particularly their metaphysics and their natural philosophy, and he moved forward from there. The esotericists or the Batiniya, this group was really interesting. There's a lot that could be said about this in a particular group. If people want more information on this, I would say go to the Munfith class that we did. And we actually did a very thorough reading of this section on the Batiniya. These were individuals who believed that certain people had special knowledge. And, it was their knowledge that allowed us to come into a proper understanding of reality. And so Imam Ghazali basically says, like, this methodology is completely bunk. It creates a type of fideism. It creates a sort of approach to religion that is utterly dependent on other than the self in ways that are really foundational, right? Like, in other words, I can't arrive at any real knowledge until this individual who has special knowledge tells me that it's accurate. And it's more nuanced than that, but as Imam Ghazali says, what this breeds is a kind of like rote conformist personality who only adopts a position insofar as what they have been told by their master. And as he says, like, that's beyond what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created the human being with. Like, you have an intellect, and that intellect allows you to know certain things. And then it also allows you to, relegate certain things based on specialties and specializations in society to know, like, there may be things that are above me, but I know who to go to for those things. But not everything is above me, right? Like, even the positions that I hold in relationship to who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is and my relationship with him, there has to be something that allows me to make that decision. Otherwise, what's going on here? Yeah, but they don't take it to this place, right? And as you'll come to see, like Ismailism, as it develops, it breeds a sort of antinomianism, which is the concept that you arrive at a place where you no longer have to do anything in the religion. Like, the Sharia basically just becomes pale or, blank for you. Because it's all this inward reality to the degree that there really is no more outward reality. It's just this inward thing. So that's that. Now, the last group that he talks about, and the group that he really emphasizes, are the people of tasawwuf. And he says that these people are people of spiritual refinement and cognition. And for them, knowledge is primarily experiential knowledge, right? So this, for him, really becomes sort of the emphasis. And as he says, it's in this particular methodology that I came to realize what I was looking for, right? What I was looking for, as he says in the beginning. You can go back to it. Whoever thinks that the unveiling of truth depends on precisely formulated proofs has indeed straightened the broad mercy of God. What is he looking for? Yeah. Yeah. So that's true. That's true. I'll ask you this though. I mean, from this phrase, okay, what stands out to you in terms of what he's looking for? What's that? To know Allah. Okay. But how is he describing it? How is he describing it? Yeah.
How I do this and at least what I take away from it, just say truth.
These data points, yeah. But how is he describing it? What is his objective? Unveiling of truth. Unveil the truth. This word is very important. The unveiling of truth. Kashf. Okay. What he's saying here is that there is a type of unveiling. There's a type of reality, okay, that can be brought about or realized in the individual. And it's not something that's going to come about through these very systematic, formulated proofs. It comes through a type of tasting and experience that brings about that reality, right? Who also talked a little bit like this? From the different groups that we talked about. Do you remember? What were the Falasifa after? And how did they say that you arrive at that? Yeah, but what do you do? That's right. And then what happens? Huh? You get enlightened through your connection to the active intellect. You remember that like little sort of cosmological chart that we showed? So yeah, it's this process of intellection. You keep thinking, intellecting until you finally arrive at the active intellect. You become sort of subsumed in that, and that unveils reality. Okay? Remember that? So Imam Ghazali is using somewhat similar terminology when we're talking about the unveiling of reality. Except for him, he's saying that it doesn't come through thinking. It's not you sitting and like thinking and having these proofs and like constantly intellecting. How does it happen? Yes, it happens through this science of tasawwuf. That's how it happens. And he's very clear about that. Tasawwuf is how that happens. Okay, so it becomes extremely important then to understand what is this discipline. And we can see how he's also showing us that this discipline is not disconnected from theology. Like these things go together, right? So when we're talking about the marriage of the mind to revelation, we also have to think about what it means for us to put the mind, insofar as our understanding of revelation, right, as a kind of package, into a sort of harmony and connection with spiritual purification. Does that make sense? Otherwise, there's also something missing. And so the science of tasawwuf then becomes the science by which we realize that reality. Now, tasawwuf is this like term oftentimes that's brought about in our community and creates a little bit of anxiety. Like, oh, like Sufi and tasawwuf and, these things, what they mean and how they're applied or not applied becomes something that, many people question. Okay. So what is tasawwuf? Tasawwuf, insofar as the understanding of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah are concerned, is the third branch of Islam. So when the Prophet ﷺ was asked, what is Iman, what is Islam, and what is Ihsan, okay, that dimension of Ihsan is what we understand, okay, insofar as what is being preserved through the science of tasawwuf. In other words, tasawwuf is a science that develops in order to preserve that understanding of ihsan. And تعبد الله كأنك تراه فإن لم تكن تراه فهو يراك. The sign, it's the dimension of the religion whereby which we are worshiping God as if we see him. And if we can't see him, that we know that he sees us. What the ulama call al-mushahada, we see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Or if we're not able to arrive at that level, the level just below it is muraqabah, that we're sort of taking ourselves to task, knowing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala always sees us. Okay? So it is concerned with the realization of humanity to its highest potential and the conformance of the heart and limbs to ultimate reality. How do you do it? You know, one of our shuyukh, I asked this, like, you know, what's the most simple definition that you can give of how you do tasawwuf? He said that you just apply the sharia. Tasawwuf is an application of the sharia. That's what it is. So the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ is the means by which we do this. So it's not only the outward manifestations, but also the inward realities to these things. And this is exactly what Imam Ghazali was saying. He was saying, listen, when we look at what we're told to do in this religion, whether we're talking about theological doctrines or we're talking about the legal doctrines, okay? We have to understand that these things were not mandated in order for us to simply have this very superficial understanding of them. So like, I can know what the doctrines are that I have to believe and why they're true. But why did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tell me to believe in these things? Why did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tell me to engage it in that manner? فَعْلَمْ أَنَّهُ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا اللَّهُ. Well, I know that what that means also carries an internal reality. And that internal reality is that I bring about a state wherein which there is nothing other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Wherein which what I see of the world in every moment is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this isn't like to play with, you know, philosophical concepts that are a little bit above and beyond my pay grade. But it's simply to try to get us to understand that if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the only wajib wujud, as we talked about, the necessary being, okay, that means that our being is contingent on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in every moment. Which means that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is creating every moment that we are experiencing right now. And that becomes your dialogue ultimately with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There is nothing happening in your day, in every single moment, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not creating specifically to bring you to him. That's why we believe La ilaha illallah. That's what that is. Right? That's what La ilaha illallah is. As we talked about before, Ruh ya ana, ya fasid al-tarkibi, ya ha'ilan bayni wa bayna habibi. You know, get away from me, you like false construct. You who have created a barrier between me and my beloved, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And again, this isn't to try to say that everything is one, you know, we don't actually have existence. No, we do, but our existence is contingent on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so that should make us very aware that everything that is happening is in light of that. Okay. Also, the fiqh of our religion. And Imam Ghazali talks about this, you know, what is the fiqh of our religion? Was wudu mandated in order for us to like simply just throw water on ourselves before we go to pray? Is that what that's about? Like just go throw some liquid on you and come and pray? Or is there something else to it? Inshallah, before we end this class, I'm going to show you all a video. Wallahi, just watching this video will give you an understanding of what wudu is. Because for a very long time, at least for myself, I made wudu and had no idea what I was doing. Until you see someone making wudu, where you're very aware that this person is doing something that I've never done before. And it's not because what they're physically doing is different, even though it is a little bit. It's because there's something being brought into the wudu that we have never really conceptualized properly. The same thing with the prayer, right? We go into prayer and it's just kind of like, and we get back to, that's not what that is. That's not what prayer is. And so Imam Ghazali is saying, like, look, all of you, and particularly he's saying, like, you, tullab ilm, all of you scholars, basically, right? Who think that all of this is simply just you giving this opinion and you giving this opinion and you giving fatwas and you knowing all of these things and you being able to, like, you know, spout off by memory all of these hadiths that you know and all the stuff that you know. No, that's not what this religion is. That's not what it is. It's about really implementing this religion in a way that brings about these realities. It's about making wudu such that you actually see sins coming off of your body. It's about going into the prayer and completely leaving this world, completely transcending beyond yourself in time and space. It's about being able to actually see the realities of the Quran that you're reciting, to see them in physical form. Like I'm talking about, you know, I have a story of a friend of mine who said, you know, and this was a hafiz of the Quran very early on in his life. I asked him, like, how did you continue to preserve it? Because one of the things that people know in memorizing the Quran, it's really hard, is that if you don't keep up with your recitation, you'll lose it. So I said, you know, how did you constantly keep up with it? Because so many of us, we tried and then we would stop for a long time and then you lose all of it. He said it was because of what I was seeing while I was reciting the Quran, leading prayers. He said one time, you know, I would talk about certain concepts of, you know, the stories that I was reciting, and I would see them. Or I would, you know, talk about certain foods that we're going to eat in Jannah, and I would swallow, like from the recitation, I would swallow and I would taste that food. This is not a joke, right? And I believe this individual, like he wasn't making this up. So yeah, like that's what it means. That's what this religion means implemented. It's so beyond this very superficial, like do some moves, say some things and move on. That's not what this is. And so the way of realizing that ultimately is in this purification of the self, is in coming into an understanding that what I'm implementing insofar as the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ is not simply just in words and deeds, but it's in states, right? That I'm actually trying to bring about these states of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. So the tariqah aspect of tasawwuf, or the path, okay, includes certain essentials and terms and conditions that pertain to the process of traversing the path to haqiqah, to actual reality, all right? So while traversing the path to reality, one is going to confront a number of stations, okay? And you encounter them, as they say, principally of two types. The first is what's known as a hal, okay? A hal is a temporary state, doesn't require special effort, but can come about as a result of dhikr or prayers or any of the ritual devotions, as a matter of fact, as I talked about before. Just you praying maghrib, you know, that should be sufficient. As well as coming into contact with blessed people of the path. And this becomes one of the means by which individuals are brought into this understanding. Simply just being around those who have fully realized this will bring about this state within you, okay? And if it's hard to understand, I'll tell it to you like this. We've all been around people in our lives who simply by just being around them have put us into a particular state that is a little bit ineffable. Like we don't really know how to explain it to them. Maybe it's your grandmother. Maybe it's someone from your family who, is constantly in a room reading Quran or whatever it is that they're doing, constantly with their prayer beads, Or maybe it's just someone that somewhat unexplainable, even in the sense of like what it is that they're doing. It's just every time that you're around them, you seem to feel like you understand reality a little bit better. Things make sense and you actually feel something internally. Now, this is marked oftentimes by a type of spiritual awakening. It's a somewhat euphoric feeling. It leads to a kind of opening that's known as an expansion or bust, okay? Or also can come about through a constriction, or what's known as qabd. Now that's temporary, okay? Even though, there are some people who can actually experience this, it extends for quite some time. A maqam, by the way, this also has very real, like psychological understandings to it. I mean, for us, we don't separate between psycho and spiritual. The West wants to say that there's this kind of like psychoanalysis that we can have that's void of any of these other more spiritual aspects of the way that we understand life. But no, psychology and spirituality actually go hand in hand. That's why if you want to know about psychology from within the classical tradition, you would have to go into the books of Tasawwuf to get there, because that's what they're talking about. Like when you wake up and you feel a particular way, and oftentimes we just want to explain it away through like materialistic means, or the food that you ate or something like that. Not really. It's a very reductionist way of thinking about what's going on. And the Islamic spiritual tradition actually has a much more holistic way of giving you an understanding of why you feel the things that you feel at the particular times that you feel them, and what you can do from a holistic perspective to change those feelings, to actually bring about different states, right? A maqam is a realization of a state. It's oftentimes precipitated by a hal, but it usually requires active mujahada, spiritual exertion or effort, okay? And is of a hierarchical nature, where the beginning of one maqam is preceded by the end of another maqam. Each successive maqam is a prerequisite for the one after, hence one cannot purport a maqam of istiqamah or uprightness before fulfilling the rights of the maqam of tawbah, for example. So you'll have different lists, okay? They'll say, for example, typically, they'll say that you begin with tawbah. There's a type of feeling that comes over your very being of you needing forgiveness, turning back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that's the first stage. And it's something that sort of encapsulates your entire being. Where people like literally will get up in the middle of the night and just feel like they need to turn back to God. Certain situations that have played out in your life that you no longer can pretend didn't happen, try and escape from through the various means by which we have to escape today, the distractions that we have. Now it's very real. Like, no, I'm confronting this head on. And the minute that you do that, it's tawbah. It's turning back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I like turning back. I mean, this is one of the things that Michael Sujic, who was just here with us, he tried to stress this. We talk about tawbah as repentance. And in many ways, it doesn't really capture what tawbah is getting at. Yes, there's an aspect of repentance, but there's also a turning towards Allah, which is where the root of the term tawbah comes from. They're turning back to God. This happens, by the way, often with people who go through some really traumatic experience. That's why Imam al-Harawi said that the first stage isn't tawbah, it's yaqada, that you're awakened to something. You become woke, but like really woke, not the other woke. And I've seen this happen. Like I know people, for example, in Egypt, very early on, who were just living their life in ways that weren't really living their life. Let's just say it like that. And, subhanAllah, they were on their way to some party and they got into a car accident and they're like really, really, really good friend, somebody that we knew really well in our community, died at a really young age, you know, at that age that you would hope that you would be able to like get past. You know what I mean? And he didn't get past it. And I remember it like changing every one of these individuals' lives. Like all of them immediately turned back to God. Alhamdulillah, this individual, you know, his family and his friends and the community kind of, we got behind them and they did a lot of khair in his name. You know, and it's really amazing the type of khair that was done in his name and what it's doing right now, because, you know, they built a mosque, and that mosque in Cairo in 6th October has literally become the place that like all of the students go to learn, and all of the scholars go there to teach, you know. So it just means that, you know, this family really had the right and real intention for their son. Allah forgive him and grant him the highest abodes of Jannah. So there's something that can happen in a very sort of traumatic fashion that allows you to really like, you wake up, you know, you don't see life the same way. Now, what's also interesting is that, you know, as Imam al-Ghazali talks about, you can also get back into the groove of things, as we say, and forget everything, almost as if like that never happened. And so if you don't act upon it and you don't take advantage of that blessing really that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put in front of you, you can lose it. So, you know, these are different stages then that you're going to go through, and these stages are hierarchical in nature and will arrive at the highest stage, oftentimes talked about as either rida, you know, rida Allah, where you're completely content with everything that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has manifested or ordained in your life, or as some would say, that it's love, mahabba, you know, where you've inculcated a real love of everything in such a manner that it brings about this kind of contentment, right? So the Sharia is the outward manifestation of fulfilling Allah's commands and avoiding His prohibitions. It's not limited to matters of legal rulings, as we said. It's also inclusive of the Prophet's internal states. The haqiqah is the divine reality that permeates all aspects of the universe and the human condition. So this is that unveiling of reality, haqa'iqul ashya, as they would call it, okay? It can be thought of as that which is not subject to human proclivities and understandings, as is the case with the Sharia, but it's of a quality that transcends the aforementioned. It also can be thought of as Allah's qada and qadar, and any human perception of some aspects of the haqiqah can only be accessed vis-a-vis the tariqah. Okay, what does tariqah mean? We're talking about a path, walking the path of suluk and sayr, right? Spiritual wayfaring. And this path is going to be taken vis-a-vis those who have taken the path. And this is what Imam al-Ghazali ultimately comes to realize, that in the claims of the people of Tasawwuf, what I saw in them that I did not see in any other group, and we'll end on this, is that these individuals, they were talking about something that could be experienced by everyone through a kind of cause and effect relationship. You do these things, these effects will happen. So it's scientific in that sense, right? It's scientific in the sense that, you know, if you bring about certain types of causes, these effects will follow. And you can continue to repeat that in ways that are shown in each individual who has actually taken this particular trajectory. So Tasawwuf is a science that is really bringing about this dawqi, this experiential reality, through the means of understanding cause and effect from people who have taken this journey, who will tell you that here are the things that you're going to see, types of signs that you should look for, right? And there are many people who have written on this. Ibn Ata'illah Secondary, for example, who has written on this, literally telling you how all of it is going to flow, right? The beginning being simply just you letting go and turning back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. من علامات الاعتماد على العمل نقصان الرجاء عند وجود الزلل. That, you know, from the signs that you were dependent on yourself, نقصان الرجاء عند وجود الزلل, is when you give up when you make a mistake. In other words, what he's trying to say here is that the first step is in you letting go, in you giving up that sort of false pretense that you have control over the things that are happening in your life. That you don't. And the minute that you give it up and you give it to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you can begin this journey. And you'll begin to realize that it's not about whether or not you made the mistake or didn't make the mistake, but what you do when that mistake happens. Where are you when you have gone into that particular dimension? And that's a turning to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So you can see it kind of in various ways that the ulama have described it. This is what Imam al-Ghazali brings to the equation, is that he says these individuals, they're not really after a lot of discussion. As a matter of fact, they don't really like talking at all. They simply just live, and they bring about these realities through their implementation of the religion, which for him was very difficult because, again, for him it was just, I can talk about this religion, I can teach this religion, I can do it in that fashion, but to actually do this religion in that way, that was actually very difficult for him, right? To sit and actually go through a wird and to like make dhikr properly and to pray properly and to actually implement this religion properly such that it brings about these realities. That's a whole other sort of reality that has to be explored. And it's not something that's going to come about because you know a lot of this stuff that is written in books, or you've memorized a lot of this information or data point. It's because of something else. It's because of this experience that you've had with the religion. And that experience, once it has been tasted, once it has been realized, once it has been unveiled, you no longer are in any way, shape, or form deluded by the types of things that oftentimes self can come in and delude you to think about or to assume that isn't actually part and parcel of reality. And this is the reason why Imam Ghazali says that it's this trajectory that all of us need to be on. Many people can do it in various ways. You know, he says that you need a sheikh, you need someone to actually show you this reality. And it makes sense. I mean, I know that there's a lot of taboo around this now because, you know, abuse and the people that are charlatans who are claiming things that they actually don't hold and that kind of stuff. And that's, you know, this is really problematic. We need to do away with this. But at the same time, we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. If I wanted to be a black belt in martial arts, I'm not going to assume that I can just do it without a master, a sensei. Yeah, YouTube, right? I don't just get on YouTube and start to like. No, I need someone to go through this process with me and to actually show me, like, am I getting it or am I not getting it? And similar, if not more so, is the reality when you are traversing the spiritual path. To do so in a way with someone who has traversed this path, who has gone the distance and can tell you how to go that distance. You know, and this is a very special person in many ways. I'll end on this. I know Marcus wants people, so you know, one of the things that the shuyukh say is the difference between the real teacher and those who simply kind of went through the experience themselves is in the following allegory. There was three men who came across this really, really tall wall And they began to climb up this wall. And the first man got to the top and he looked over and he was like overwhelmed. SubhanAllah. And he just threw himself over. The second man did it and took a little bit longer. And he got to the top, he looked over and he started crying and he threw himself over. And the third man climbed up the wall. He looked over and he thought, SubhanAllah, I need to go tell other people about this. And he climbs down and begins to try and go tell other people about what it is that he's seen, this reality. There are some people who, when they've arrived at that destination, it's extremely difficult for them to come back and try to do life like this again and bring others to that. And, you know, this is something that Iqbal says even about the Prophet ﷺ himself. You know, our Prophet ﷺ went on the night journey and then transcended the entirety of the realms to be with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and then came back. Had it been me, I would have never come back. He was with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and then he came back. You know, that's who our Prophet is. And there are many people who go the distance in that sense, and yeah, they just don't come back, and it makes sense. Those who do come back and are really adamant about trying to show others how to arrive there, these are very special people. And if you find this person, or these people, be with them. Really stick to them. You know, and don't be deluded. You know, this is the point. This is why the foundations are really important. This is why we went through everything that we went through. It's because there are ways to understand from an intellectual perspective whether what I'm seeing here is real or problematic. You know, as they said, if you see a man flying in the air, don't trust him until you know where he stands on the Sharia. You know, this is a story of Abdul Qadir al-Jilani, where a voice came to him and he says, he went through a kind of like euphoria, a euphoric feeling. Ya Abdul Qadir, jitnak, you know, we come to you, Ya Abdul Qadir. And he said, I felt like an amazing euphoric feeling. And then the voice reached out again and called out to me. And at that point, I felt like my entire body had like disintegrated. As he says, you know, salt disintegrates into water. And then the voice claimed, from this day forward, the Sharia is dead to you. You know, and, you know, he looked to his left and cursed Iblis, you know, and literally said, get away from me. I know that that claim, irregardless of the state that it puts me in, can never be a real claim. You know, and it says that Iblis actually made himself apparent to Abdul Qadir at that point and said, I have deceived many very righteous people using this. But today, your knowledge of the religion has saved you. So knowledge is really important. Having a foundation is extremely important because traversing this reality is something that we all want to experience. But without having solid ground to step on, you know, you can very easily find yourself in murky water and you're not really sure how to get out. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us a good understanding of our religion and a understanding that allows us to realize these beautiful truths in ways that are beneficial to us, that bring us to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that bring us to Jannah, that bring our families with us, that bring our communities with us, and that allow us to be people that ultimately live to the legacy of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. So again, you don't have to stay if you don't want to, and you can obviously anytime that you want to get up and leave, like it's okay. So, but if there's any questions or comments, we can take them now. Barakallahu feekum.